Men believe that understanding leads to control. If you understand a situation, you can manage it, fix it, or improve it. This belief is not random. Men are trained this way from an early age. In school, problems are solved with logic. In work, success comes from analysis. In life, mistakes are corrected by learning how things function. Logic becomes a survival tool. It works in systems. It works in technology. It works in planning, strategy, and competition. Over time, a man begins to assume that logic is universal, that if something makes sense to him, it should make sense to everyone else. This assumption feels natural. It feels fair. It feels rational. When a man enters a relationship, he carries this same model with him. He believes that communication solves problems, that explanations reduce tension, that if both sides understand each other, harmony will follow. And at first, this seems to work. But sooner or later, the man notices something disturbing. The more he explains, the worse the situation becomes. The clearer his logic, the colder the response. Instead of resolving conflict, his words create distance. This is the moment where confusion begins. Because from the man's perspective, he is doing everything right. And yet, the system is clearly failing. To understand why this happens, we need to look at what logic does and what it does not do. That is where the real difference begins. Logic explains events, but it does not determine attraction. This is the core misunderstanding most men never question. Logic answers the question of what is happening, while emotion evaluates what that situation means in terms of safety, stability, and viability. A man may logically explain his intentions, justify his decisions, and calmly outline why his behavior is reasonable. But none of this addresses how the situation feels on an emotional level. When a man uses logic to resolve emotional tension, he unknowingly sends a signal of uncertainty. By explaining himself, he seeks approval. By justifying his actions, he negotiates his position. Attraction, however, does not respond to negotiation. It responds to certainty and internal stability. Logic functions only inside systems that recognize logic as authority. But relationships do not operate under logical authority. They operate under perception. The more a man explains, the more he shifts from presence to defense, and defense is always weaker than confidence. This is why intelligent men often experience the greatest confusion. They have better arguments, better explanations, and better words, yet they lose ground faster than men who say very little. Logic itself is not useless. It is simply misplaced in this context. To move forward, a man must understand that emotional dynamics are not solved, corrected, or reasoned through. They are responded to, adapted to, and felt in real time. This difference in perception explains why men and women can experience the same situation in completely opposite ways without either of them consciously lying or manipulating. A man focuses on sequence, logic, and explanation, believing that clarity will naturally reduce tension and restore balance, because this method has worked for him in every other domain of life. He assumes that misunderstandings are the root of conflict, and that once both sides fully understand each other, harmony will return. A woman, however, does not evaluate the situation through sequence or explanation. She evaluates it through emotional context and present-moment stability. She subconsciously asks whether the situation feels secure, predictable, and viable right now, not whether it is logically justified. And when instability is detected, her emotional response shifts automatically, without analysis or conscious decision-making. The man interprets this shift as irrational, unfair, or emotionally inconsistent. But from a biological perspective, it is adaptive behavior. He tries to restore balance by explaining himself more clearly, defending his position, or proving his intentions, while she responds to perceived instability by creating emotional distance. This creates a feedback loop in which each response amplifies the other. The man increases effort and verbal clarity, and the woman increases withdrawal and emotional caution. The more he tries to fix the problem logically, the more he reinforces the very signal that triggered her reaction in the first place. Over time, the original issue becomes irrelevant because the real conflict is no longer about a specific event or disagreement, but about how uncertainty is processed by each side. The man believes he is demonstrating care, responsibility, and commitment through explanation, while the woman perceives the same behavior as insecurity, loss of confidence, or lack of internal stability. Neither perspective is malicious, but they are fundamentally incompatible. This is why arguments often escalate instead of resolving, and why relationships deteriorate even when both sides believe they are acting reasonably. Understanding this mechanism does not immediately solve relational problems, but it reveals why logic alone consistently fails to produce attraction, reassurance, or emotional alignment in intimate dynamics. The deeper problem is that men expect emotional systems to behave like rational ones, and this expectation silently destroys their leverage over time. A man believes that consistency, fairness, honesty, and explanation demonstrate maturity and strength, because in logical systems, these qualities are rewarded and lead to stability. In emotional systems, however, they are interpreted in a completely different way. Emotional dynamics are not stabilized by explanation or reasoning. They are stabilized by internal certainty and perceived strength. When a man feels the need to constantly clarify his intentions, justify his behavior, or correct misunderstandings, he may believe he is acting responsibly, but what he is actually signaling is internal instability. Even if his arguments are flawless, the emotional message behind them is insecurity. A woman does not consciously analyze this process or label it in words, but she feels it immediately and responds to it instinctively. What she reacts to is not the content of his explanations, but the emotional state that produces them. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful shift in the dynamic. The man gradually becomes the one seeking reassurance, approval, or emotional confirmation, while the woman becomes the one evaluating whether the situation still feels stable, attractive, and worth emotional investment. At this stage, the relationship is no longer guided by logic, intentions, or shared history, but by perception of strength and internal balance. The man often feels confused and betrayed by this shift because he believes he has done everything correctly, while the woman experiences it as a natural response to changing emotional signals. This disconnect deepens the gap between them because the man attempts to restore the original dynamic through even more explanation and effort, reinforcing the very pattern that caused the shift in the first place. This is why understanding female behavior on an intellectual level is never sufficient. Knowledge alone does not alter emotional dynamics. Until a man stops treating emotional relationships as problems to be solved and starts treating them as systems that respond to presence, consistency, and internal control, the same cycle will repeat with different people, in different circumstances, regardless of intelligence, experience, or good intentions.